Hello and welcome to RachAquarelle. Today my holiday winter series continues and I'm going to be painting in watercolor a cute little cabin on a snowy hill with some smoke coming out of the chimney, and then in the background we're going to have a beautiful forest and some northern lights. So yes, there is kind of a lot going on in this little scene, but actually it's relatively simple, as you can see from this sketch here. And I'm only speeding up the sketching part. The rest of the painting tutorial will be slowed down or in real time. And this template is going to be available to you for free. There will be a link in the description of this video where you can go to download that instantly, and then you can print it off and you can use that to transfer the drawing over onto your own watercolor paper. So yeah, I wanted to keep that design relatively simple because we're going to do a couple of iterations between applying washes and using masking fluid. It won't be quite as much as you've seen in some of my other tutorials, so this is really kind of meant to be another intermediate project where there's some things going on and, we are going to have to do a little bit of waiting for things to dry, but it's really worth it in the end because I just love some of the effects that you can get by applying masking fluid on top of areas where you've actually already painted, because you can kind of create almost a transparent effect. And I'm also going to venture outside of the color palette that you've seen me using a lot lately. So I'm going to use a little bit more of a vibrant color palette in order to do justice to these northern lights that I want to include. And I'm going to use my masking fluid here. I only need a very small amount. We're going to do just a little bit of spritzing. And you saw that this design is kind of within a circle shape, but you don't need to worry about blocking off the outside of the circle because we'll just simply rub off the masking fluid that's outside of the circle, because we're not painting outside of the circle, so it doesn't really matter if we get a little bit of extra masking fluid on the outer edges or the border of this image. So no need to worry about that. I just wanted to spritz a little bit of the masking fluid to give the effect of snow or maybe stars in the sky. I don't know. I just find that spritzing masking fluid for these winter paintings has become a bit of a theme. It's very handy. I really like the effect that you can get just by spritzing a little tiny bit of masking fluid. Okay, so this is actually my lemon yellow, my cool yellow, even though it looks green. It looks green because I have this yellow in two different places on my palette, and that's because I often use it to mix greens. And so I usually find if I have blue on my brush, I will pollute that yellow. So that's why I have that yellow in two different places on my palette. So I have one that I don't mind polluting and making it a bit green, and then the other one I try to keep pretty clean. So I'm just going to apply a very light wash pretty much everywhere on the sky portion of this painting. And now I'm adding a little bit of my phthalo blue, so this is my warm blue, and a little bit more of that lemon yellow. And I'm just going to start adding in some of this more green color. I don't want to completely obliterate the yellows in the sky because there's some areas that we want to keep really light. For the most part, this is going to be a darker scene just because we typically think of northern lights as being visible at nighttime. But there's no need to worry about, applying this in some precise way. I am looking at a photo reference just from the internet of the northern lights, so I can kind of get a general sense of where to leave things lighter and then where to make things a little bit darker. But I think that you're going to be able just to kind of use these colors and have fun and really get that overall impression of northern lights. Because it's not too many other circumstances where we see this effect in the sky. So now I'm going in with even a little bit more phthalo blue where I want things to be a little bit darker. And really like toward the bottom here at the horizon line, don't worry too much about anything because we're going to add some texture in that will give the effect of trees in the distance. So I'm just kind of trying to avoid the area that is snowy. And again, in the sky, just looking for opportunities to add a little bit more pigment while not obliterating some of the areas that are a little lighter. And you could use masking fluid to kind of block off this circular shape here. I thought about doing that, but decided I could probably pretty easily just work within that circle. I don't need the circle to be completely perfect anyway. So now I'm going in with phthalo blue into some of the snow on the hill, because of course this is a night scene, so I don't want to leave that snow completely white. I'll leave just a few little white areas in there. So I'm applying this first little bit of blue just kind of as a general wash. And now I'm going into my permanent rose and more phthalo blue to mix up a nice violet to add a little bit more shadow, especially down here at the bottom. So I'll try to keep it a little bit lighter up at the top of the hill, I think. And again, I don't think there's any right or wrong way to do this. I just want things to have a little bit of dimension, but it's not a scene that needs to look especially realistic or anything like that to get the desired effect. So just have a little bit of variation in there. And now I'm going into my ultramarine blue, which is a much cooler blue. Just adding to this very most bottom part where I want it to be very shadowy, very cold. More permanent rose down there. It's pretty wet, so I'm finding it difficult, I think, to add in a lot of pigment. And it's certainly not something I need to go overboard on anyway. Just a little bit of texture and shadow into the snow. And then I want the cabin to be covered with snow. So I'm adding just a little bit of shadow down at the base of that snow-covered roof. And then I'm going to leave the rest of it white. And then I want this little cabin to look as though it's being lived in. So I drew in one small window on the side, so I'm going to paint that yellow as though there's some light shining inside this cabin. And then I'll probably just paint the rest of the cabin with like a sienna so that it looks like a log cabin. Okay, so I'm going in with more of that lemon yellow and phthalo blue and a little bit of my ultramarine blue as well. And I'm going to just go in and start adding a bit of texture back here for these distant trees. So I want to keep these trees fairly light. I wasn't exactly sure how to handle this because I want these trees to look like they have a bit of dimension. So typically with atmospheric perspective, the more distant the trees are, the lighter they would be. I'm not sure that that necessarily holds true for night scenes. But again, this doesn't need to be a completely realistic depiction of this scene. This is an entirely fictional scene anyway. So I just want to start adding a little bit of texture back here to kind of mark in where these trees are going to be. And then I do need to make sure that the sky and those trees are completely dry before I apply any masking fluid. And I'm primarily going to be applying masking fluid where I want it to look like there's smoke coming out of the chimney of the cabinet. So while I'm waiting for those areas to be really, really dry, I'm gonna go ahead and start painting the cabin. So I'm using some sepia, and I just kind of added that to one of the violet mixes that I had so it wouldn't be too bright of a sepia. Sepia tends to look a bit orange, so if this is a night scene, we want to tone that down a little bit. So I just used some of the violet that was already mixed on my mixing palette. And I'm using a small brush just to kind of paint that in very generally. And then the front door, I'm just going to paint red. Thought that would be a nice contrast. We have a lot of really, really cool colors in this composition. So I thought maybe this one little spot of red would be a nice complement to all of that cool, snowy, wintry color. And then of course also just using that to paint the chimney as well. And now I'm adding in some of my ultramarine blue to make it a little bit darker. And then over on this side, I'm just going to go over it one more time with this slightly darker color, just to give it a little bit of dimension. So that side, I guess, is going to be in shadow just a little bit more than the front side. And I'm adding just a little crisscross on the window. It's not very noticeable, but figured may as well give that a try while I'm waiting for other things to dry properly. And I'm testing it with my fingers. You want to make sure that it's not even slightly damp. So I decided just to pause and then come back a little bit later. So I've waited for this to completely dry. I'm getting out just a little bit more of my masking fluid. And this time I'm going to use one of my silicone applicator tools to apply a lot of masking fluid. So I'm going to block off just this horizon here because I want to go in with some even darker trees and I don't want to have to worry about accidentally painting onto this white snow. So I'm going to block just a line where this hill is, where the hill meets the base of the trees. And then I'll also block off parts of the cabin, especially of course that roof that is covered in snow because I want that to stay nice and white. And I don't want to have to worry about having to try to paint around all those little corners when I'm going in really dark with more of that tree texture. So I'm applying the masking fluid really, really thick. And it will take a little while for it to dry, but it's worth it because you want to make sure that you're not, missing an area that's really important. And now I'm kind of just outlining where I want the smoke to be. I can still see one of my lines from when I transferred this drawing to my watercolor paper, but then this other line over on the right has pretty much disappeared into the paint. So I just looked back at my template to kind of get a general sense of how I had originally drawn that line. And now I'm just going to use the masking fluid to fill in that entire area. So what will happen once that masking fluid is dry, I'll apply more washes to the sky to darken the sky up, but then that area will have this appearance of almost being transparent, as though the smoke is just kind of obliterating the sky a little bit, because that area will be maintained as this lighter color while everything else becomes a little bit darker. So kind of a cool effect that I really enjoy doing. Just takes a little bit of patience and planning, but definitely worth it. And when you're applying masking fluid as thick as I am here, I think it's best just to leave the painting alone, go find something to do to distract yourself, and then come back later and you'll see the difference in how the masking fluid looks when it's dry. So it's wet right now, it's kind of white and milky looking. And I'm going to leave this alone. And I'm back. And so I still have all that masking fluid on there. The difference now, of course, is just that it's become a little bit more transparent. It kind of has a yellow look to it. And if you touch it, it'll be a little bit tacky, but it won't come off on your finger. And that's how you know that it is dry enough to go ahead and paint on top of. So I'm going in with more of the ultramarine blue. This usually reads as a darker blue than phthalo blue, so I'm going to use this on the parts of the sky that I want to be really, really dark. And you just paint right on top of the masking fluid. And you'll see that the water and the pigment beads up on the masking fluid a little bit, but it's not going to be able to penetrate that layer. And of course, I do want to make sure that I maintain some of those lighter colors that I had initially put down. With the Northern Lights, you usually get like one streak of really bold green or, you know, whatever color. And then the rest of the sky can be pretty dark. And so now I'm going back onto the trees. So I don't want to completely cover up that layer that I had initially put down. So I'm kind of treating those trees as though they're more in the distance, and then I'm putting darker trees in front, overlapping but not covering entirely those more distant trees. And I'm not painting individual trees. I'm basically just, you know, starting at the base and then doing upward strokes, leaving kind of a pointed edge at the top. So I'm thinking of it more really as like a texture than like painting trees. And because they're so distant, you know, we can easily get that effect. Now I'm going in with even more pigment for the trees up front. Smaller brush, so I have a little more control over the top edges of those trees. And I know that I want them to be really, really dark at the bottom. So I'm trying to use a lot of pigment. And again, I also have masking fluid on the roof of the cabin, so I don't have to worry too much about that area. I don't have everything covered in masking fluid, basically just the roof. And then I want to go even darker. So I'm getting that ultramarine blue, and now I'm going in with my warm red, which for me, I'm using a warm red called Scarlet Lake. I think it's by Daniel Smith, because I want to make kind of the top part of the sky really, really super dark. And I'm not going to get there just with blue. So adding a little bit of that red, I usually find darkens up the color quite a lot. So I want to apply this in some areas of the sky and even here at the base of the trees, but I don't want to go overboard, of course. It's very easy to kind of go overboard as you're layering your watercolors, and then you end up accidentally obliterating some of the brighter colors that you wanted to maintain. So just be mindful of not going overboard. And so right here you can kind of see I went outside of the circle, and so what I did is I cleaned off my brush so there's no pigment on the brush, and then I dropped a little water on that area and then really quickly went and picked that up with my paper towel, and now that little mark is basically gone. So that's a little tip if you do get some pigment outside of an area that you intended. As long as you keep that pigment wet and then pick it up really fast, a lot of times you can save the day with just a little bit of quick action. Okay, so I have let this dry, and I'm going to make a bit of a mistake pretty soon coming up here, which I will show you and talk about how you can handle that because mistakes happen. It's just kind of part of it. All right, so here we go. Watch where I'm pulling the masking fluid off, and oh, it ripped my paper. I haven't had this happen before actually, and I'm not sure why it happened because I know that everything was really, really dry. So I don't know, that masking fluid, it just binded to the paper a little bit too much. So I'm trying to minimize the damage. Once I realized it was tearing, I kind of stopped pulling in that direction and went to the opposite side of the masking fluid area and pulled toward the tear just to kind of minimize how much tearing there was going to be. And it's not a super big deal. Like, you can obviously see it here, but the paper is damaged, and I am going to try to go over it with a little bit more paint, and you'll see that it's not very effective because the paper is damaged and it's just not going to accept pigment the same way that the undamaged portions of the paper would. So I've got some ultramarine blue on my brush, and I'm trying to remedy this just by adding a very light wash to this area, but it's just going to look a little bit different. And then I'll have to kind of try something else. So you can see how different that torn area looks compared to everything else. I'm just trying to kind of soften all of this up a little bit. I'm on damage control right now. But almost never is this kind of thing a fatal accident. Yeah, I would of course prefer that it had not happened, but I think that where there's a will, there's a way, and so I like trying to find ways to kind of remedy little errors like this. And ultimately what's going to work is just adding a little bit of texture to this smoky area with some white gouache, and that's going to just kind of conceal the damage a little bit. Right now I'm still kind of fiddling around with the ultramarine blue, trying to make it work. Kind of in denial, I think. Trying to soften things up just a little bit. And I know it's not working out so well for me, but I think I decided just to go ahead and make sure I've got all that spatter removed. I think that made a really nice effect. I didn't go too overboard with the spattering, but it did give a really nice effect of, you know, either stars in the sky or snow falling on the ground. It doesn't really matter which. And now I'm going in with some white gouache. And I'm just going to kind of add some texture here. So I'm not completely covering up this area. I'm basically just adding some lines. And adding the lines will give enough variation within this area that one area where the paper is torn won't be so noticeable because we have other variations in this same area as well. And it's kind of a bummer in a way just because, you know, I used the masking fluid to get that certain effect. I didn't really plan to use gouache. I was really, really careful to maintain a lot of my whites in the areas that I wanted to be a little bit lighter. But, I mean, this texture is kind of nice, actually. So, I think overall, it's a win because this painting still works. Yep, and that is going to be basically it, I believe. I guess I'm just fiddling here a little bit, as I tend to do. Trying to make these whites a little bit more opaque in some areas. And yeah, I think that's it. So this was actually a really fun project, and it went really well, of course, until just the very end. But again, nothing that can't be solved with just a little bit of effort and luck, I guess. So I'll let you see this up a little bit closer Really like how it turned out. It's kind of simple, and yet there's like just so much vibrancy going on in here. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope you'll give it a try yourself. It's really not bad to do. I might actually redo it because I like it so much. And remember that there's a free template in the description. Thank you so much, and I hope that you will join me again tomorrow for another tutorial. And if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to my new little channel. I'd really appreciate it. And leave me comments with your thoughts or anything that you might want to see. Thank you.